So, quick story. Matthew Ballard started in the third week of January in 2020. No, 2019. No, 2020. And Matthew, by the way, no, it was 2019. And Matthew started in the first week or third week of January, kind of similar to when some of you started. Matthew sold $6,000 worth of Cutco in his fast start, Devin, as a student at Utah Tech. And at the end of his fast start, Lauren, I sat down with Matthew and I said, "Hey, just so you know, you sold 6K in your fast start. You're pacing for the All-American scholarship. Can I show you what that would look like?" So I showed Matthew what it would look like. We basically pulled the numbers together, and what it looks like to win a scholarship in the spring and in the fall is you got to be the top 20, you got to be in the top 25 student sales representatives in the company, in the top 50 in the summer. Now, I've trained people that have hit it in every time of the year. We've had a person in our office named Quentin Israelson who hit 9 All-American scholarships back to back. Either he was in top 25 or top 50 every single campaign, 9 years, 9 semesters in a row. So I walked Matthew through the numbers. Here's what it basically looked like. Anybody that did over $20,000 in sales in the spring campaign usually had a shot at being part of the top 25. So I sat down with Matthew, I ran the numbers, and we figured out the numbers that he needed to do $25,000 in sales, because $25,000 in sales almost would always get you within the top 25. And because number 25 usually finishes somewhere around 19 to 20. At least that was what the current numbers were at the time. So I sat down with Matthew. I said, "Hey, let's make a plan to do, to sell $25,000 worth of Cutco this semester." So we broke it down, and he needed to do another 120 appointments for the rest of the semester. So we broke that down by the week. And basically, Braden, he just needed to do 8 to 10 appointments a week in order to stay on track for that. Now, in order to stay on track for that goal. So Matthew made phone calls 3 times a week. Okay. And he made 20 phone calls 3 times a week and made 60 calls a week and consistently booked between 8 to 10 appointments, right? Because that's actually like a 7, 8 to 10 rule. If you're keeping track of that, after you get past your initial list, it's usually not a 4 to 1. It's like I always went by 10 to 1. If I wanted to book one demo, I was willing to make 10 calls. And so I'd like plan accordingly. And when I'd book more demos, I was always pleasantly surprised. So Matthew made 20 phone calls Tuesday morning at Champions Club because he didn't have class that interfered with that meeting. He made 20 calls Wednesday or Thursday morning at Champions Club, and he made 20 phone calls Wednesday night during team meeting. 60 phone calls, 3 waves, got him 8 to 10 appointments booked a week. And he ended up selling 23,000. He didn't quite hit his goal of 25, but he sold $23,000 worth of Cutco in the semester and came in like number 10 in the nation or number 12 in the nation for the All-American Fast Start, or for the All-American, not Fast Start, All-American Scholarship. Why do I bring this up? Matthew made 20 calls. Now, back in the day, we didn't have the workbook. We didn't have spreadsheets. We'd actually just keep track of our stuff on like a physical handwritten list. So you know what Matthew would do every single time he sat down in my office to make phone calls? He'd have a scratch piece of paper, and he used to use Sharpies, and he'd have his top 20 customers written out on this list. He'd actually do it long ways. Okay. The top 20 customers written out on the list. And as he booked appointments, right, let's say he booked an appointment with like number 3, he'd cross off number 3, and then he'd go to the bottom of the list, go to his recommendations notebook, your app, aka where you got your recommendations, and he'd add one more person to the bottom. And he'd cross them off as he booked them, add 3 more to the bottom. I cross a couple more off, add them as he booked them. Does that make sense? So he always had his top 20. And then every couple phone jams, he'd have to rewrite the list because he kept crossing them off, and he'd like recondense the list. What I'm about to show you now in the workbook is basically the same thing. So if we go over here, right, and we take Anthony's workbook and we just copy it, or take his top 20 list, we're going to copy it. Now, all we got to do is we're going to delete the people he's already completed appointments for. All right. And Grammy and Rico. Great. These are the other people he wants to focus on. So here's a quick way you can do this. You go to data, sort, and we'll just do it alphabetically. Bam. Now what does Anthony want to do? Anthony wants to go to his prospects section, and from his original list or from recommendations, I recommend sticking with your original list as long as you can, by the way. He's going to go through and he's going to add another 7 people. So that way, when Anthony goes to make phone calls, he can always sit down and be ready to crank out 20 calls because he already knows who he's going to call. Does that make sense? What you don't want to be during a phone jam is like a perpetual scroller where you're like, who am I going to call next? I'm not quite sure. Staley, always want to show up to every phone jam having that next top 20 like locked and loaded. So it's almost like you can slap the magazine in the app, so to speak, and then just start firing away and start making calls. So with that in mind, I want you to do the same thing. I want you to go to your workbook, reorganize your top 20 list. And in a moment here, I'm going to get your demo goal.